Nando Parado lay on the frozen metal floor of the plane, unable to open his eyes because of the blood caked on his broken face. It was 1972. At that moment, he did not yet understand that he was alone with the most ruthless mountain environment on the planet. The survivors slowly came to their senses after the devastating crash, gradually realizing the monstrous reality of the plane crash over the lifeless peaks. Next to them lay motionless those who, just a few hours earlier, had been laughing carefree, making plans and enjoying their youth. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening, being in a state of deep traumatic and physiological shock from the impact. The surrounding world had rapidly turned into an endless icy desert where human life had absolutely no objective value. At first, no one in the group wanted to say it out loud, diligently pushing away the terrible thoughts that they would never be found. They still acted as a crew and a close-knit team, listening intently to the howling wind in anticipation of the roar of search planes. But deep down, everyone already understood that the situation was getting worse with every passing minute of this endless, icy day. Panic spread among the people much faster than the cold, infecting the minds of young men who were facing the real face of imminent death for the first time. Some already understood clearly how it would end, looking doomfully at the endless expanse of snow-covered peaks of the Cordillera, hiding their bodies from the rest of the world. It all began in sunny and warm Montevideo, where the air was filled with the smells of the ocean, blossoming trees, and boundless youthful optimism. The rugby team was in peak physical condition, preparing for an important friendly match in a neighboring country on the other side of the mountains. They were strong, healthy, and confident young men for whom life seemed like an open and bright road to the future. They saw the trip to Chile not as a harsh test, but as an exciting adventure and a well-deserved vacation with close friends. They packed their bags with jokes and laughter, carefully folding light suits for walks along the warm streets of Santiago. Nando Parado was looking forward to this trip more than most, as he had managed to persuade his mother and sister to accompany him on the journey. For him, it was a chance to show his family the world, spend time with them, and share the excitement of the upcoming sporting event. Families said goodbye at the airport, hugging their sons, brothers, and friends, unaware that for many these hugs would be the last in their lives. The atmosphere of anticipation for the holiday hung over the crowd of passengers, completely drowning out any possible premonitions of the impending tragedy. The weather conditions over the mountain range suddenly began to deteriorate rapidly, forcing the captain to decide to make a stopover in the Argentine city of Mendoza. This unplanned stop caused only slight irritation among the impatient young men who wanted to get to their destination as soon as possible. They spent the evening in local cafes, enjoying the warm climate and completely oblivious to the hidden threat of the high snow-capped peaks. The mountains rose on the horizon like a dark, insurmountable wall, patiently waiting for the moment when the metal machine would attempt to challenge them. That night in comfortable hotel rooms was the last contact with normal, civilized life for all the passengers on the flight. The plane began a rapid climb, trying to jump over the sharp stone teeth hidden under a thick blanket of heavy gray clouds. The temperature outside dropped sharply, and the windows were covered with a thin layer of frost, hiding the external danger from the passengers' eyes. Some young people were seeing snow up close for the first time, looking with interest at the white peaks floating dangerously close to the wings. They still called it just a beautiful landscape, not realizing that they were looking at their future icy prison and mass grave. The expedition to Chile was slowly turning into a one-way flight, with a lifeless glacial plateau as its destination. The surrounding space was filled with thick, impenetrable fog, which deprived the pilots of any visual orientation in the complex mountainous terrain. Turbulence began to toss the plane from side to side, forcing passengers to stop talking and cling tighter to the armrests of their seats. The cheerful mood instantly evaporated, giving way to growing anxiety and a primal fear of the blind power of the atmospheric elements. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening, but each instinctively sensed the approach of something irreparable and terrible. It was the last moment before history finally unfolded into a blood-curdling nightmare. Nature had no insidious plans. It simply existed according to its own laws, making no exceptions for lost travelers. Suddenly, the clouds parted, and a giant black wall of a mountain peak appeared directly ahead, rushing straight toward the cockpit. The roar of the engines running at full throttle mingled with the screams of terror from people who realized the inevitability of a head-on collision with the rock. It was the moment when illusions were finally shattered by the cruel reality of the harsh and indifferent physical world. A long and incredibly painful journey awaited them, and not all of them would make it to the end in this snowy desert. The critical moment came with a deafening screech of tearing metal, when the plane's right wing caught on a sharp rock ledge. The impact was so tremendous that it instantly tore off the tail section of the aircraft, throwing several passengers straight into the icy abyss. When the movement stopped, an eerie, unnatural silence hung over the glacier, contrasting sharply with the recent roar of the failing engines. At first, no one could utter a sound, being in a state of profound physiological and emotional shock from the fall. Then the silence was broken by the first moans of the wounded, cries for help, and the cries of those who realized the severity of their physical injuries. The survivors began to slowly crawl out from under the rubble of broken seats, looking in horror at the sight of their unexpected and terrible landing. The horizon was empty, and each of the survivors instantly realized that they had ended up in a completely lifeless and hostile place. Medical student Roberto Canessa immediately began examining the injured, using scraps of clothing as tourniquets and bandages. Horrific fractures, deep wounds, and traumatic brain injuries required immediate surgical intervention, which was impossible in these wild conditions. He knew that many of those who were breathing heavily on the frozen floor would not survive even the first night on the glacier. Communication with the outside world was irretrievably lost, and the radio in the destroyed cockpit was completely inoperable. This was the turning point, the moment after which they finally ceased to be ordinary people and entered into a battle for survival. As dusk fell, the temperature began to drop dramatically, forcing the survivors to huddle together inside the wrecked fuselage. They closed the huge hole in the tail with a pile of suitcases, pieces of skin, and snow trying to block the icy draft. They huddled together, trying to warm themselves with their breath and the heat of each other's bodies, shivering from the unbearable cold and creeping fear. No one wanted to take responsibility for predicting how long they would have to spend in this frozen metal pipe. The morning brought with it dazzling sunlight, reflecting off the white snow and causing a sharp pain in their inflamed eyes. But this light did not bring a drop of warmth, only mercilessly exposing the extent of the destruction and the number of lifeless bodies in the snow. The survivors counted their numbers and realized with horror that the losses were enormous, and their situation was only getting worse. Supplies were running low, consisting of only a few bottles of wine, chocolate bars, and crackers found in the scattered luggage of passengers. It was a pitiful amount of calories to sustain life at such a high altitude in sub-zero temperatures. Nando Parrado's awakening on the third day after the crash was a real miracle for the other survivors, one that was hard to believe. He slowly opened his eyes, trying to focus on the dirty and exhausted faces of his companions leaning over his frozen body. His head was splitting with pain, and his thoughts were confused, preventing him from immediately realizing why he was in this strange and icy place. They gently told him about the death of his mother and the serious condition of his sister, whose moans he soon heard from deep within the dark fuselage. At that moment, he did not yet understand that he was left alone to protect his dying family in these inhuman conditions. The meager food supplies ran out incredibly quickly, despite the strict rationing and the tiny, almost invisible portions. Hunger began to dictate its terms, twisting their stomachs with painful spasms and causing constant dizziness whenever they tried to stand up. They began chewing on leather straps, tearing pieces of upholstery from suitcases, and trying to swallow cardboard to somehow trick their empty stomachs. But these substitutes provided no energy, only exacerbating the feeling of weakness and causing severe digestive disorders. They began to economize on words as well as food, because even simple conversation required the expenditure of precious calories that were melting away with each passing hour. On the 8th day of isolation, Susana's breathing became intermittent and wheezy, and then stopped forever in the frozen air of the Cordillera. Nando closed her eyes, sinking into a state of deep emotional numbness that protected his mind from instant madness. At that moment, everything depended solely on him, on his ability to transform unbearable grief into cold, calculated determination to survive at any cost. He was left alone with the cold, without family, without a past, with only an endless white plain ahead of him, ready to become his grave. At first, it seemed like an unbearable sentence, but then it turned into the only powerful incentive not to give up and keep breathing. During the day, the sun turned the glacier into a blinding oven, burning unprotected skin with ultraviolet rays and causing painful blisters and cracks. The survivors made improvised sunglasses from the plastic windows of the cockpit to protect themselves from the unbearable glare of the snow. They melted snow on metal sheets, eagerly licking up precious drops of water, as dehydration set in even faster than hunger. At night, the thermometer dropped again to critical levels, turning any touch of the metal fuselage into a burning torture for bare skin. Nature made no distinction between day and night, using different but equally cruel methods to destroy uninvited guests. Weakness reached such a degree that even climbing a steep slope a few meters to relieve oneself became a feat. Many stopped going outside, relieving themselves directly inside or near the shelter, which led to appalling sanitary conditions in the camp. Human appearance was rapidly fading, giving way to primitive instincts, where the main goals became the search for warmth and the satisfaction of the gnawing feeling of emptiness in the stomach. They looked at each other and saw not friends, but dying creatures whose bodies were slowly consuming themselves from within in order to stay warm. It was a process of slow destruction, where each day that passed took away a part of their humanity, leaving only the bare skeleton of the instinct for self-preservation. On the 11th day of their stay on the glacier, Marcelo Perez, the team captain, managed to dig out a small transistor radio from the pile of luggage. This device became a magical artifact for them, the only thin thread connecting their godforsaken camp with the rest of humanity. They built a makeshift antenna out of scraps of aircraft wiring, spending hours catching signals from distant Chilean radio stations through heavy atmospheric interference. The voices of announcers from a warm, cozy world seemed to them like messages from another planet, bringing the illusion that they were still part of society. They huddled around the small plastic case, holding their breath and afraid to miss a single word about the progress of the rescue operation. Panic spread faster than the cold as the realization of absolute total abandonment washed over each inhabitant of the torn fuselage in a heavy wave of despair. Some began to sob hysterically. Others fell into a catatonic stupor, staring blankly at the frozen wall of their iron tomb. Marcelo, who until that moment had kept the team's faith in the rescuers alive, was completely broken by this news, losing the meaning of his leadership. They looked at each other and saw fear, which had now grown into absolute certainty of their imminent death in the ice. The horizon was empty, and he knew it. Each of them now knew for sure that no one would ever come to their aid in this wilderness. But the mountains had a new test in store for them, as if wanting to finally finish off those who dared to challenge their majestic tranquility. At the end of October, a powerful snowstorm hit the glacier, trapping the exhausted people inside the fuselage for several endless days. They lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howling as it threw tons of snow onto the fragile metal roof of their only refuge in this world. A sense of impending doom hung in the stale air, causing people to listen anxiously to the dull rumbling growing somewhere high up on the slope. Nature was in no hurry to kill them. It was simply accumulating a critical mass of snow, preparing to deliver its most devastating blow from behind. 8 people died that night, suffocating under the weight of the avalanche before they could be dug out from under the thick snow armor. Among the dead was Marcelo Perez, whose spirit was broken even before the mountains took his physical shell. The survivors made a small ventilation hole with a metal rod, allowing a thin stream of frosty air to enter their cramped tomb. They found themselves locked in an even tighter space, forced to sit huddled together with the corpses of their recently deceased friends. The silence between them became heavier than the wind, emphasizing the hopelessness of the situation of people buried alive at an altitude of 4,000 meters. In those terrible hours, the last remnants of civilization disappeared under the snow, exposing the basic, naked biological instinct for self-preservation of any living creature. They realized that hope did not change reality, and reality was that their dead comrades were their only source of protein and calories. It was a thought that initially caused nausea and primal horror, but now it pulsed in their exhausted brains as the only correct solution. They looked at each other in the darkness, and each knew what the other was thinking, although no one dared to break the taboo first. It was a moment that changed everything forever, dividing the world into the living, ready for anything, and the dead who had become food. The discussion about the necessity of eating human flesh became the most difficult test of their moral and religious convictions. Roberto Canessa, as a medical student, was the first to take on the heavy responsibility of scientifically justifying this step to the exhausted group of survivors. He coldly and rationally explained that their bodies were consuming themselves, and that without an external source of protein, death would come within a few days. Most of them were devout Catholics, for whom such an act seemed unthinkable blasphemy and a direct ticket to the depths of hell. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but hunger proved stronger than millennia-old dogmas, causing their stomachs to scream louder than the voice of conscience. The process took place in secret, away from the main camp, to spare the others the horrific sight of human bodies being cut up. Roberto and a few other strong young men took on this terrible burden, trying not to look at the faces of those lying under a thin layer of snow. They cut the frozen meat into thin strips, laying it out on pieces of aircraft skin under the rays of the cold Andean sun to dry. When they brought the first portion to the others, a deathly silence fell over the fuselage, broken only by the howling of the piercing mountain wind. No one wanted to take responsibility for the first bite. Everyone waited for someone else to cross the invisible line separating them from madness. Some were never able to bring themselves to cross that barrier, preferring a slow death from exhaustion to violating their deep inner taboos. They faded away quietly, turning away from the fuselage wall, refusing the terrible food offered to them, and accepting their fate with frightening resignation. Their bodies soon replenished the food supplies for those who chose life, creating a macabre cycle of survival in complete isolation. This was not the end of their humanity. It was the beginning of a real, primitive test in which it was not the most moral who survived, but the most adaptable. They still believed that salvation would come, but their hope for outside intervention faded with each passing day, giving way to a cold determination to act on their own. Nando understood that they could not sit and wait forever, because even this meager supply of food would inevitably run out someday. The rest of the group watched their preparations with a mixture of desperate hope and deep, paralyzing fear of losing their leaders forever. They helped sew a sleeping bag from the fuselage's insulation materials, fastening pieces of fabric with copper wire with fingers numb from the cold. At that moment, everything depended solely on the two of them, on their endurance, strength of spirit, and ability to withstand the merciless elements. They knew they were heading for certain death, but staying meant slowly rotting alive, waiting for the mountains to take them one by one. There was no way back, and ahead lay a wall of rock and ice that they would have to overcome without equipment or mountaineering experience. The first hours of the ascent were incredibly difficult for them. Every step in the loose, deep snow required enormous expenditure of scarce physical energy. The air at an altitude of almost 5,000 meters was so thin that their lungs burned and their hearts beat in their chests like frightened birds. Their sports shoes slipped on the icy sections of the rocks, threatening to tear them into the bottomless abysses gaping on both sides of the narrow, dangerous ridge. They climbed upward with sheer stubbornness, digging their frozen fingers into the snow and clinging to the sharp protrusions of frozen, lifeless rocks. At that moment, he did not yet understand that this was only the beginning of a journey that would require him to go beyond the limits of human biology. The morning of the third day brought them the most terrible psychological torture when Nando Parado was the first to reach the summit of the insurmountable pass. He expected to see the green valleys of Chile, roads, and signs of civilization, which would mean the imminent and inevitable rescue of their lives. Instead, his inflamed eyes were met with a monstrous sight, an endless panorama of snow-capped peaks stretching for dozens of kilometers beyond the horizon. The hope that had sustained his muscles all these days collapsed in an instant, shattered by the cruel reality of the Cordillera's geography. He stood on the summit, buffeted by the icy wind, and realized that they had made a fatal mistake by venturing into the heart of the impassable mountains. But Nando looked to the west, where a barely discernible strip of land, free of eternal snow, was visible between two distant peaks. He made the decision to keep going, even if it meant certain death from exhaustion in the endless labyrinth of rocks and deep gorges. They sent Antonio back to the fuselage, taking his portions of meat to increase their chances of survival in this marathon of death. On the seventh day of their journey, the landscape began to change imperceptibly. The snow cover became thinner, giving way to bare rocks and hard ground. There was more oxygen in the air, which allowed their exhausted lungs to breathe a little deeper, although weakness still shackled their bodies. They stumbled upon a mountain stream, whose meltwater they drank greedily, enjoying the forgotten taste of pure moisture without the taste of metal. In the evening of the same day, a man on horseback appeared on the opposite bank. Chilean shepherd Sergio Catalan, checking on his distant herd. The noise of the river prevented them from shouting to each other, but the shepherd understood that he was facing exhausted people in need of urgent emergency help. He gestured that he would return the next day, leaving them to spend the night on the shore, with hope that was now real and tangible. That night, Nando and Roberto slept peacefully for the first time in many months, knowing that their endless nightmare was finally coming to an end. From that moment on, time ceased to be their enemy and became their ally, counting down the hours until their return to normal life. The sound of the blades of the Army rescue helicopters cutting through the thin mountain air was the most beautiful music to those who remained at the fuselage. They ran out onto the snow, waving their arms and crying with happiness as they watched the metal birds descend toward their cursed ice camp. The rescuers who jumped out onto the snow were shocked by the sight of the survivors, dirty, emaciated skeletons emitting a heavy smell of death and decay. But even greater horror gripped them when they saw gnawed human bones scattered around the wreckage of the plane, right on the snow. The reality of how these young people had managed to survive for 72 days became clear without any additional verbal explanations. The evacuation took place under difficult conditions, with helicopters barely coping with the turbulence at such an altitude, picking up the survivors in groups of several people at a time. Those who boarded looked down at their icy prison, where their dead friends, brothers, and fellow travelers remained. The ocean of snow and stone remained as indifferent to their rescue as it had been to all their inhuman suffering. They flew away to civilization, leaving behind a place that had forever changed their essence, severing all ties with their past selves. There was no turning back. They were returning to the world of people, but they carried with them a dark secret that not everyone would be able to understand and accept. The bodies left in the mountains were later buried under stones near the crash site, away from prying eyes under the protection of a cross. The mountains took 29 people forever, whose fates were cut short on this nameless glacier due to a tragic navigation error by the crew. Their grave remained where the silence is broken only by the howling wind and the occasional rumble of snow avalanches descending the steep slopes. The relatives of the deceased found the strength to forgive the survivors, realizing that their children had become a source of life for their best friends. This bond, sealed by blood and death, proved stronger than any social conventions or religious prohibitions of the civilized world. The lives of the 16 survivors were never the same again. They tried to return to normality, start families and work, but the past would not let them go. They often got together because they were the only ones in the world who truly understood what they had gone through in the snow. Nando Parrado became a successful man, but he never forgot the cold and fear that forged his iron will on the glacier. The most frightening thing in everyday life for them was people's indifference to trifles, to a piece of bread or a sip of clean, unsalted water. They brought with them a particle of that icy emptiness in their eyes, which could not be melted by any warmth of human communication. On the day Nando and Roberto reached the river, they proved that the human spirit can be harder than granite and stronger than ice. They did not disappear without a trace, did not dissolve into the white mist. They fought for their right to live against the most ferocious elements on planet Earth. And as long as these mountains exist, the shadows of the 16 survivors and 29 victims will be invisibly present on the snow-covered slopes of the Cordillera. They walk forever on the ice, dragging hope behind them, striving for the distant horizon where green grass means salvation. This story has not faded away after decades, sounding like a powerful hymn to incredible human resilience. The ending of this story is not that they were able to save themselves, but who they were forced to become for the sake of this miraculous rescue. They ceased to be just carefree young men from good families and became a symbol of a desperate, primitive struggle for existence on the brink of the impossible. When you look at the majestic peaks, remember that beneath their beauty lie ruthless laws that show no mercy to the weak. We all walk on the thin ice of our civilization, hoping that it will bear the weight of our ambitions and our self-confidence. And every night, the mountains fall asleep to the sound of the wind, keeping the secret of madness, despair, and incredible human courage. They did not know if they would survive that first night, but they held out for 72 long days that changed the concept of the limits of the human body. Nature was in no hurry to kill them. It simply waited for them to give up, but they refused to comply with this icy sentence. The Andes did not kill them quickly. They gave people a choice: surrender to entropy or cross all boundaries for a breath of air. And they coped with this task frighteningly well, leaving us with a story that makes our blood run cold. The winter that tried to break them made them immortal in the memory of mankind.